My name is Carlos Diablo Hernandez, and for 8 years I was a soldier, then a shot caller for the Mara Salvatrucha in Los Angeles. For nearly a decade, I believed that Armando Eliu Melgar was the supreme leader of our organization, the man whose word was law from the barrios of El Salvador to the streets of Washington, D.C. But I was wrong, dead wrong. Melgar was nothing more than a carefully constructed front, a face designed to draw attention while the real power operated from the shadows. This is the story of how I discovered the truth about who really controls MS-13 and why that truth is more terrifying than any government or law enforcement agency has ever imagined. I was jumped into MS-13 in 2014 when I was 17 years old and angry at a world that had never given me a fair chance. My family had fled El Salvador when I was 8, escaping the civil war that had torn our country apart. We settled in Westlake, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in Los Angeles, where the choice wasn't whether you'd join a gang, but which one would claim you first. The Mara found me before anyone else did. I was getting beaten down by some bloods outside my high school when 3 MS-13 homies stepped in and saved my life. They didn't ask for anything in return, didn't pressure me to join, just told me to remember who had my back when it mattered. That kind of loyalty meant everything to a kid who had never belonged anywhere. The initiation was brutal but straightforward. 13 seconds of getting jumped by 5 veteranos while Vida Loca by Sad Girl played on repeat from someone's phone. 13 seconds that felt like an eternity. But when it was over, I wasn't Carlos anymore. I was Diablo, and I belonged to something bigger than myself. My first lessons about MS-13 hierarchy came from my sponsor, a veterano called Shadow, who had been with the clique since the 1990s. Shadow taught me the rules, the signs, the stories that connected our Westlake set to the broader MS-13 organization that stretched from Los Angeles to Long Island, from El Salvador to Spain. Listen, mijo, Shadow would tell me while we tagged walls in MacArthur Park. This shit is bigger than you can imagine. We're not just some street gang fighting over corners. We're part of an army that spans continents. And at the top of that army is a man called Melgar, Armando Eliu Melgar. That name is God to us, you understand? When word comes down from Melgar, it's not a suggestion, it's scripture. For years, that's all I knew about leadership. Melgar was the supreme commander, the man who made decisions from his prison cell in El Salvador that affected every MS-13 member worldwide. When we received orders to tax certain businesses, to eliminate rivals, to move drugs through specific routes, those orders supposedly came directly from Melgar through a chain of command that stretched from Central America to our local cliques. The structure made sense in the way that military hierarchies make sense. Clear lines of authority, unquestioning obedience, severe consequences for disloyalty. Local shot callers reported to regional leaders, who reported to national coordinators, who supposedly received their instructions directly from Melgar's inner circle in Salvadoran prisons. But as I rose through the ranks, earning my stripes through violence and loyalty, I began noticing inconsistencies that didn't fit the narrative I'd been taught. Orders that contradicted previous instructions, strategic decisions that seemed to serve no clear purpose. Conflicts between different levels of leadership that suggested the chain of command wasn't as unified as we believed. My first real doubt came in 2017, during a war with the 18th Street gang that escalated far beyond what anyone had expected. The conflict started over a relatively minor territorial dispute in the Rampart area, the kind of localized beef that usually got settled with fists or maybe a drive-by shooting. But, instead of de-escalating, the violence kept spiraling upward in ways that hurt both gangs economically and strategically. I was part of a crew tasked with hitting an 18th Street drug house in Koreatown, a mission that was supposed to send a message about respecting MS-13 territory. But when we arrived at the target location, we found it empty except for 2 elderly Korean immigrants who had no connection to any gang. The intelligence we'd received was completely wrong, and our mission turned into a home invasion that brought massive heat from LAPD without accomplishing any strategic objective. When I asked Shadow about the failed mission, his explanation didn't make sense. According to him, the orders had come down from Melgar through the usual channels, but when I pressed for details about how such specific tactical intelligence had been gathered, Shadow became evasive. Don't worry about where the orders come from, Diablo, he told me. Your job is to follow them, not to question them. Melgar sees the bigger picture that we can't see from down here. But I was starting to see patterns that suggested the bigger picture might be different than what we'd been told. The war with 18th Street was costing both gangs money, members, and territory, while seeming to benefit law enforcement agencies that used the violence to justify increased funding and expanded operations. Someone was profiting from the chaos, but it wasn't clear who. The breakthrough came in early 2018 when I saw was arrested during a sweep operation that targeted MS-13 leadership across multiple states. I spent 4 months in county jail awaiting trial, sharing cells with MS-13 members from different regions who had their own stories about orders, operations, and the mysterious sources of strategic intelligence. One of my cellmates was a guy called Flaco from the Virginia cliques, a veterano who had been moving drugs and coordinating operations on the East Coast for over a decade. Flaco had been closer to national leadership than anyone I'd ever met, and his stories about the organization's structure revealed details that contradicted everything I thought I knew. According to Flaco, he had participated in several meetings with supposed representatives of Melgar's inner circle, high-ranking MS-13 members who claimed to speak directly for the supreme leader. But Flaco had noticed that these representatives often contradicted each other, gave conflicting accounts of Melgar's strategic vision, and seemed to have different agendas despite supposedly serving the same master. I started paying attention to the messengers instead of just the messages, Flaco told me during one of our late-night conversations. These cats who said they spoke for Melgar, they didn't act like soldiers following orders. They acted like they were making their own decisions and using Melgar's name to give those decisions weight. Flaco's observations matched my own growing suspicions about the disconnection between supposed orders from Melgar and the actual strategic impact of those orders. Too many missions that served no clear organizational purpose. Too many conflicts that weakened MS-13 without strengthening anyone else we could identify. But the most disturbing information came from a homeboy called Joker from the Long Island cliques, who had been arrested for coordinating drug shipments from El Salvador to New York. Joker claimed to have met Melgar personally during a trip to El Salvador in 2016, a meeting that was supposed to be the highest honor an MS-13 member could receive. I flew down to San Salvador expecting to meet the Godfather, you know, Joker explained. The man who built this whole empire, who commands respect from soldiers all over the world. But when I finally sat down with Melgar, something felt off. He was asking me questions that he should have already known the answers to if he was really running operations in New York. He seemed confused about details that any real leader would have memorized. According to Joker, Melgar appeared to be receiving his own briefings from advisors who seemed to know more about MS-13 operations than he did. Instead of giving orders, Melgar was asking questions about organizational structure, financial flows, and strategic priorities that suggested he was learning about his own supposed empire rather than directing it. It was like meeting the president and finding out he doesn't know what his own government is doing, Joker concluded. Melgar had the title, but someone else was writing the script. When I was released in June 2018, I returned to the streets with a new perspective on MS-13 hierarchy and a determination to understand who was really making decisions for our organization. I began paying closer attention to the sources of orders, the patterns of intelligence, and the strategic outcomes of various operations. What I discovered was a system of control that was much more sophisticated and much more disturbing than a simple prison-based command structure. Orders that supposedly came from Melgar were actually originating from multiple sources that seemed to coordinate with each other but operated independently of any single leader. The first piece of the puzzle came through my new responsibilities as a shot caller for drug operations in the Westlake area. Instead of receiving orders through the traditional chain of command, I was contacted directly by individuals who claimed to represent different aspects of Melgar's organization. Financial coordinators, strategic planners, intelligence analysts. These contacts never met face-to-face, communicated only through encrypted messaging apps, and seemed to have detailed knowledge of law enforcement activities, rival gang operations, and market opportunities that would be impossible for prison-based leadership to obtain. The financial coordinator, who identified himself only as banker, provided detailed instructions about money laundering, investment opportunities, and profit-sharing arrangements that were far more sophisticated than anything I'd encountered in traditional gang operations. The strategic planner, General, offered intelligence about law enforcement operations and rival gang activities that proved accurate with disturbing consistency. Most mysterious was the intelligence analyst Prophet, who seemed to predict law enforcement actions, rival gang moves, and market changes with almost supernatural accuracy. Prophet's information allowed our clique to avoid several major busts, exploit opportunities for territorial expansion, and eliminate rivals who were planning moves against us. But as I worked more closely with these shadowy coordinators, I began to realize that their intelligence was too good, their strategic vision too comprehensive, and their resources too extensive for any organization controlled by a man in a Salvadoran prison cell. The revelation that changed. Everything came in September 2018, during a meeting with Prophet that was supposed to brief me on an upcoming law enforcement operation targeting MS-13 financial networks. Instead of the usual encrypted messages, Prophet requested a face-to-face meeting in a warehouse in Vernon, an industrial area where privacy could be guaranteed. I expected to meet another MS-13 veterano, maybe someone who had worked his way up through the ranks and earned the right to coordinate intelligence operations. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit who spoke perfect Spanish but had obviously never spent a day in any barrio. "Carlos," he said, using my real name instead of my gang moniker, "I think it's time you understood what you're really part of." The man introduced himself as David Morrison, a former CIA operative who had specialized in Central American operations during the 1980s. After leaving the agency, Morrison had established a private intelligence consulting firm that worked with various clients interested in managing criminal organizations for political and economic purposes. According to Morrison, MS-13 was not the autonomous criminal organization we believed it to be, but rather a managed asset that served the interests of multiple powerful groups, government agencies that needed justification for increased funding and expanded powers, private prison companies that profited from high incarceration rates, defense, contractors that sold surveillance and military equipment for domestic law enforcement. "Melgar is real," Morrison explained, "but he's not in control. He's a figurehead, a symbol that gives the organization legitimacy and mystique. The real decisions are made by people like me, people who understand how to use criminal organizations as tools for achieving larger strategic objectives." Morrison's explanation made sense of patterns I'd been observing for years, why MS-13 operations often seemed to benefit law enforcement more than the gang itself, why conflicts escalated in ways that attracted media attention and political response, why strategic decisions sometimes contradicted obvious organizational interests. MS-13 wasn't being controlled by criminal masterminds seeking profit and power, but by shadow operators who used the gang as an instrument for manipulating public opinion, justifying policy decisions, and maintaining social control through managed chaos. The conversation with Morrison lasted 3 hours, during which he provided documentation that supported his claims, contracts between his consulting firm and various government agencies, financial records showing payments to MS-13 coordinators, intelligence reports that had been used to direct gang operations. Most disturbing were transcripts of meetings between Morrison's team and high-ranking law enforcement officials, where they discussed strategies for managing MS-13 activities to maximize their political and economic value. The gang wasn't being fought by the authorities, it was being choreographed by them. "Your organization serves multiple purposes," Morrison told me. "You provide justification for immigration crackdowns, funding for law enforcement expansion, contracts for private prisons, and political talking points for candidates who need to appear tough on crime. The violence is real, but it's controlled violence, directed towards specific outcomes that serve specific interests." Morrison offered me a choice: continue serving as an unwitting asset in their larger strategy, or become a knowing participant who would be compensated for helping to manage MS-13 operations in ways that served his clients' interests. The offer was tempting in ways that scared me. Morrison was proposing to pay me more money than I'd ever imagined for work that was essentially what I was already doing, just with better intelligence and clearer strategic direction. He wasn't asking me to betray MS-13, just to help guide it in directions that would be more profitable for everyone involved. But accepting Morrison's offer would mean acknowledging that everything I believed about MS-13, everything I'd fought and bled for, was a lie. The brotherhood I'd found in the gang, the respect I'd earned through violence, the identity I'd built as Diablo, all of it was based on mythology that served someone else's agenda. I told Morrison I needed time to think about his offer, but I had already made my decision. I was going to expose the truth about who really controlled MS-13, even if it meant destroying the only family I'd ever known. Over the following months, I carefully documented evidence of Morrison's operation and MS-13's manipulation by outside forces. I recorded conversations with the mysterious coordinators, photographed documents that revealed the true sources of gang intelligence, and identified other members who had been recruited as knowing assets. The most damning evidence came from tracking financial flows that connected MS-13 operations to accounts controlled by Morrison's consulting firm. Drug money that supposedly went to support imprisoned leaders was actually being diverted to fund intelligence operations. Weapons purchases that supposedly strengthened the gang were actually putting them under deeper surveillance. And territorial expansions that seemed to increase MS-13 power were actually exposing them to law enforcement monitoring. In March 2019, I reached out to a journalist who had been investigating connections between criminal organizations and intelligence agencies. Through encrypted communications, I provided documentation of Morrison's operation and MS-13's manipulation by shadow controllers. The journalist Sarah Chen from the Los Angeles Times spent months verifying my information, cross-referencing my documents with her own sources, and building a comprehensive picture of how MS-13 had been turned into a managed asset rather than an autonomous criminal organization. But before Chen could publish her investigation, Morrison's people reached out to me with a final warning. They knew about my cooperation with the journalist, they had evidence of my betrayal of MS-13 interests, and they were prepared to use both law enforcement and gang violence to silence me permanently. Carlos, Morrison told me during our last conversation, "You've misunderstood the nature of the game you're playing. This isn't about MS-13 versus law enforcement or criminals versus society. This is about power structures that are much larger and much more complex than anything you experienced in your neighborhood gang. You can't expose us without destroying yourself and everyone you care about." Morrison was right about the consequences of exposure. In April 2019, I was arrested on federal racketeering charges that carried a potential life sentence. The evidence against me was comprehensive and damning, clearly the result of surveillance that had been ongoing for years. But more devastating was the response from MS-13 itself. Word spread through the organization that I had been cooperating with law enforcement, providing information that led to arrests and seizures that weakened the gang's operations. I was marked for death by the same brothers who had once trusted me with their lives. The irony was perfect and intentional. I was being destroyed by both law enforcement and MS-13 for exposing the fact that they were secretly working together to manage gang activities for mutual benefit. I spent 2 years in federal prison, most of it in protective custody due to threats from MS-13 members who believed I had betrayed the organization to its enemies. During that time, Sarah Chen's investigation was quietly killed by her editors, citing legal concerns and insufficient corroboration of sources. The truth about MS-13's manipulation by shadow controllers remains buried, protected by the same secrecy that allows the operation to continue. Melgar is still presented as the supreme leader. Morrison's consulting firm continues to profit from managing criminal organizations, and young men like I once was continue to join MS-13, believing they're part of an authentic brotherhood rather than a managed asset. I was released in 2021, a broken man who had lost his gang identity, his freedom, and his faith in authentic resistance to oppression. The MS-13 I had loved and served was revealed to be a puppet show, with strings pulled by powerful interests that profited from criminalized communities and managed violence. Today, I work with community organizations that try to steer young people away from gang involvement, but I can't tell them the whole truth about what they're really joining. The story of MS-13's manipulation by intelligence agencies sounds like conspiracy theory to people who haven't seen the documentation I collected, haven't met the shadow controllers I encountered. But I continue to speak out because young men deserve to know what they're really signing up for when they join MS-13. They're not becoming soldiers in a resistance movement or members of an authentic criminal brotherhood. They're becoming assets in a larger strategy that uses their desperation, their anger, and their need for belonging to serve interests that see them as expendable resources. The real leaders of MS-13 aren't imprisoned gang founders or street-smart veteranos who earned respect through violence and loyalty. They're shadow operators like David Morrison, people who understand how to weaponize criminal organizations for political and economic purposes, who profit from chaos while remaining invisible to public scrutiny. Armando Eliu Melgar may be the face of MS-13 leadership, but he's not the brain. The brain belongs to intelligence professionals who have turned one of America's most feared gangs into a managed asset that serves their clients' interests while maintaining the appearance of autonomous criminal activity. This is my confession, my testimony, my warning to anyone who thinks they understand how criminal organizations really work. The most dangerous puppets are those who don't know they're being controlled, and the most effective puppet masters are those who never appear on stage. MS-13 continues to operate, continues to recruit desperate young men, continues to generate violence that serves powerful interests while destroying marginalized communities. The gang members believe they're fighting for respect and survival, but they're actually fighting to maintain a system that profits from their oppression. My name is Carlos Hernandez, former MS-13 soldier, former believer in authentic criminal brotherhood, former asset in someone else's strategic game. I spent 8 years serving masters I never knew existed, fighting battles that served interests I was never allowed to understand. The streets are still there, the poverty is still there, the desperation that drives young men to seek brotherhood and violence is still there. But now I know that the gangs they join aren't escapes from the system that oppresses them. They're another part of that system, carefully managed to serve purposes that have nothing to do with the dreams and needs of the people who bleed for them. Remember this when you hear about MS-13 in the news, when politicians use gang violence to justify harsh policies, when law enforcement agencies request expanded powers to fight organized crime. Ask yourself who really benefits from the fear, who profits from the chaos, and who remains invisible while others pay the price for managed violence. The puppet show continues, but at least now you know to look for the strings.